On June 6 at about 7:00 a.m., the Hitler Youth Division received orders from the SS Panzer Corps headquarters to take part in combat operations. It was placed under the operational control of Army Group B under the command of Field Marshal General Rommel. We were instructed to concentrate in the area of Lisieux, east of Cayenne. Before doing so, the division was to arrive directly to the LXXE Army Corps at Rouen. This order had a disastrous effect. The avenues of approach prepared up to that point were not utilized. The only thing that now mattered was to get the division closer to the coast as quickly as possible. It was also unclear how to involve the division in combat operations. All of this required a mass of time compared to the previously planned rapid movement from the division's staging areas into the combat zone. We were unsuccessful in our attempt to change the new orders in the primary authority. In the corps to which our division was attached, there was no telephone communication with Army Group B. The order to march was prepared in the division headquarters immediately and arrived in the units between 9:30 and 10:00. The reinforced 25th S Grenadier Regiment moved out at about 10:00. The reinforced 26th S Grenadier Regiment at about 11:00. Both the 25th S Grenadier Regiment, which operated with the 2nd Battalion, 12th SS Tank Regiment, and the 26th S Grenadier Regiment, which operated with the 1st Battalion, 12th SS Tank Regiment, were to redeploy to an area east of Lisieux. For the time being, the divisional headquarters was located east of Thilly-sur-Varve, where radio communication was established with it. Only the reporting point was established at Lisieux. At about 3 p.m., the division received orders by telephone from Army Group B to concentrate in the area east of Cayenne and prepare to attack. The division was first placed under the operational control of LXXE Army Corps at Low OW. Later it was transferred to ITS Panzer Corps. At 1600, 16 hours after the first report of the enemy, the reinforced 25th SS Grenadier Regiment was ordered into action. The regiment was to attack the area west of the Carpiquet, Verson, Louvigny line. On its left flank, the reinforced 26th Grenadier Regiment was to concentrate in the area of Saint-Mauvier, Cristo, Fontenay-le-Pesnel, Chaux. Chaux, the 12th SS Tank Engineer Battalion, was to attack in the area of Esquit. The 12th SS Reconnaissance Battalion was to attack in Thiais-Ursel. Support formations were to be east of the Orne River in the Fort de Grimbos and Fort de Cuiby area, moving west only after nightfall. Division headquarters was relocated to the northern edge of Fort de Grimbos. The time had come. The soldiers got into their vehicles. The liaisons on motorcycles roared down the streets. The engines of the fighting vehicles roared. How often have we experienced such moments of launching? In Poland, in Central Europe, in the Balkans, in Russia, and now again in Central Europe. We old soldiers looked to the future with concern. We knew what lay ahead of us. In contrast, our wonderful young soldiers looked at us with laughing eyes. They had no fear. They were confident in us. They believed in their strength and will to win. How would these young men prove themselves? Enemy attack planes flew over us. They were diving on the marching column, tearing to pieces the flowers of life. Tanks swiftly skipped through treacherous crossroads. Von Buetner's reconnaissance company was far ahead. I waited for reports from him. So far, everything was shrouded in fog. My experienced driver drove the car forward, cautiously as always. Clouds were rising in the west. Cayenne, the town from which William the Conqueror had begun his victorious journey across the Channel in 1066, had been destroyed. More than 10,000 men and women were buried under the smoking rubble. The town became a giant cemetery. On the Cayenne-Falaise road we came across French refugees. A bus was engulfed in flames. Soul-wrenching screams greeted us. We couldn't help. The door was jammed and the exit to freedom was blocked. Mutilated bodies were hanging from broken windows, blocking the exit of those who remained inside. How horrible. Why were the civilians on fire? But we couldn't afford to mess up the schedule. We couldn't stop. We needed to push even further forward, developing the offensive. The forest drew us in like a magnet. More and more Allied attack aircraft flew overhead. We were being relentlessly pursued, but we could not afford to go into hiding. The march had to go on. A string of Spitfire planes attacked the last platoon of the 15th Company of the 25th SS Grenadier Regiment. Rockets and other weapons were harvesting a harvest of death here. The platoon was moving through a ravine. Deflection was impossible. An old French woman ran toward us shouting, "Murderers! Murderers!" Our soldier lay on the road, blood streaming from his throat. A shrapnel had severed his artery and he died in our arms. The ammunition in the amphibious vehicle exploded with a terrible rumble. The fire exploded high into the sky, and the vehicle was torn apart. But in a couple of minutes the wreckage was already pushed aside. We couldn't stop. We had to keep going. Darkness fell. The 15th Company of the 25th SS Grenadier Regiment crossed the Cayenne-Willabocage Road. I was looking forward to the 1st Battalion of the 25th SS Grenadier Regiment. Continuous attacks from the air slowed the pace of the movement considerably. Finally, Waldmuller reported the arrival of the battalion, and I was informed that the air raids had resulted in no significant casualties. At about 2300 hours, a liaison officer of the 21st Panzer Division reached me. This division was fighting near Traun and north of Cayenne. The division commander, Lieutenant General Fuchtinger, was waiting for me at the command post of the 716th Infantry Division. I set off immediately. German bombers were crossing the road at low altitude. As soon as they reached the area of the supposed Allied invasion, they were met with intense barrage fire. Several of our trucks were burning on the road. It was a hellishly difficult road. The town of Cayenne was a sea of fire. Excited people wandered through the ruins. Streets were blocked off and smoke billowed over the burning city. Beautiful old churches were turned into piles of rubble. The labour of many generations was turned into a sea of ashes and ruins. All this happened despite the fact that there was not a single German military unit in the city. Allied coalition bombers killed French citizens and irrevocably destroyed cultural sites. From a military point of view, the destruction of Cayenne was a grave mistake. The bunker was located in a quarry. It went deep into the ground. The moans of wounded soldiers of the 716th Infantry Division and the 21st Panzer Division could be heard in the passageway. Doctors and orderlies worked feverishly. The wounded were stacked in ambulances to send to the rear. At 0 o'clock, I stood in front of the commander of the 716th Infantry Division, Lieutenant General Richter. This division had experienced the firewall of the attacking Allied coalition forces and after 24 hours had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Although the division still held defences at strong points, communications between regimental, battalion, and divisional command posts no longer existed. Nor was anything known about which positions had been captured by the enemy. The division commander briefed me on the situation. The pause was interrupted by a telephone call. One of the regimental commanders, Colonel Krug, was reporting from his bunker, asking for further orders. He reported, "The enemy is over the bunker. I have no means of opposing him, nor do I have communication with my units. What am I to do?" A sepulchral silence prevailed in our bunker. Everyone looked at the division commander. His reply was shocking. "I cannot give you further orders. Do what you have to do." The 716th Infantry Division was destroyed in the full sense of the word. It no longer existed. It fought bravely. But the enemy's superiority in manpower and equipment was too great. The 716th Infantry Division was attacked by British aircraft on the night of June 5-6 from 23.0 until dawn. Following this, the entire US 8th Air Force, based at England Airfield, was thrown on the division section. Over 1,000 American planes attacked the defensive positions on the coast a half hour before the Allies landed. After both the British and Americans had been bombed, the war fleet began shelling the coast. 5 battleships, 2 monitors, 19 cruisers, 77 destroyers and 2 gunboats were firing with all barrels. As soon as the invasion force landed and their artillery joined in shelling our positions, Finally added their salvos to this inferno were the rocket ships. In spite of the monstrous destructive fire of the ship's guns and bombardment, many pillboxes held out until evening. But the human spirit was powerless against such an avalanche of steel and lead. The soldiers had to yield under the onslaught of such frenzied shelling, bombardment, and attacks. The site of the 716th Infantry Division became a moonscape. Only a few defenders of the defense line escaped death in the tornado of fire. After the dramatic dialogue we heard in the bunker of the 716th Infantry Division, the commander of the 21st Armoured Division briefly reported on its deployment. I was not aware of the invasion until I heard a report just after midnight on June 6 that Allied air and sea landing troops had engaged in battle in the vicinity of Traun. Since I had received orders not to advance, I had no choice at this point but to order the division to remain in place. I impatiently awaited the order all night, but no orders were received from higher headquarters. Since I was sure that my tank division was the closest to the enemy's combat area, I finally, by 6.0, came to the conviction that I must do something. I ordered my tanks to attack the British 6th Airborne Division, which had entrenched itself in a bridgehead behind the Orne. I believed that this was the most immediate threat to the German positions. Immediately after I made my decision, I received word from Army Group B that I was being assigned to the 7th Army. Finally, at 10:0, I received a combat order. I had to parry an attack of tanks attached to the 6th British Airborne Division and turn west to support the German troops defending Ka. Having crossed the Orne, I moved north to the coast. By that time, the enemy, consisting of 3 British and 3 Canadian divisions, was successfully advancing and had seized a strip of the coast to a depth of about 10 kilometres. Fire anti-tank guns of the Allies' 11 of my tanks were knocked out of action immediately after I came forward. My task force managed to crush these guns and by 19.0 to reach the coast at Lyon-sur-Mer. The 21st Armoured Division, the only tank unit ready for immediate engagement, which could decisively affect the course of the invasion, was undermined early in the battle. Instead of rushing with lightning to the cluster of landed enemy forces, the division was doomed to be smashed to smithereens. It remained passive in the K area until 6:30, attacking only the landed division at Traun. However, the enemy's main effort was not at Traun, but north of Cayenne. Units and units of the 21st Armoured Division were not engaged north of Cayenne until the afternoon. In the hands of an experienced tank commander, such as Rommel had been in 1940 and many commanders after him, the 21st Panzer Division could have created a difficult situation for the Allied coalition if the commander had gone head-on, going on the offensive in his tank. Gerian's golden rule, hit it like it is, was blatantly disregarded. The command post of the 21st Panzer Division was still in Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive, about 30 kilometres from the coast. On the night of June 6-7, the division commander had no communication with the units. Shortly after midnight, he informed us that the Allies had probably already reached the airfield at Carpique. However, he did not have any specific information. The 25th SS Grenadier Regiment immediately conducted a battle reconnaissance. At 1300 hours, it was reported that there was no enemy in Carpique, Roe, and Buburen. Burien was held by scattered units of the 716th Infantry Division. Libissen was occupied by Allied troops. The left flank of the 21st Panzer Division stretched along the railroad to Ypres. There were no German units west of Ypres at this point. The western suburbs of Cayenne and the airfield at Carpique were not defended. So the unit that was to defend the airfield left its well-equipped position in a panic on 6 June. It consisted of Luftwaffe ground support personnel. The reinforced 25th Grenadier Regiment was moving along the Villers Bocage to Cayenne Road. The regiment knew the situation from reports from liaison officers. Battalion commanders were ordered to arrive at a temporary regimental command post immediately west of Cayenne at the intersection of the railroad and highway. A pessimistic mood prevailed in the divisional bunker. It was time to leave it. I was about to leave the bunker when I was called to the telephone. Our division commander, Major General Waffen-SS Witt, was at the command post of the 21st Panzer Division at Pierre-sur-Dive and asked me to report the situation. I explained the situation as I had been briefed on it by the commanders of the 716th Infantry Division and the 21st Panzer Division. Nada did not interrupt me and at the end said, "The situation urgently requires swift action. For first of all, the enemy must not be allowed into Cayenne and the airfield at Karpik. It may be assumed that the enemy's units and formations are at this moment preparing for defense since they are not yet ready for a further offensive. Consequently, it would be a mistake to put into battle parts of our division as they are pulled up. The only possible option, to undertake an attack in cooperation with the 21st Panzer Division. Thus, the division will attack the enemy together with the 21st Panzer Division and throw him into the sea. The attack will be undertaken tomorrow at 12:00. I quickly said goodbye to the two commanders and left the bunker with my escort. There were still some wounded in the passage. The majority, however, had been evacuated. There was not a soul in the streets of Cayenne. No soldiers or citizens could be seen. Only sappers could be seen in places where the ruins had blocked the roads. Apart from the sappers working, we saw no other signs of life. Cayenne was a dead city. The suffocating smell of burning filled the streets. Burning houses lit our way. We were quiet. No one spoke a word. We were thinking about the fires in our rear in Germany. Individual airplanes flew over us. The flare bombs that the Allies had dropped on parachutes for aerial photography filled the deserted streets with bright light. Lord, where were our Luftwaffe? Our command post was located behind the highway. It was housed in a small village house surrounded by tall old trees, which provided camouflage for air raids. It was a prerequisite if one wanted to live to see another day. The house was a mess. Luftwaffe troops must have left it in any 2 minutes. They probably belonged to the unit defending the airfield that had left the area so quickly. The commander of the 1st Battalion, 25th Grenadier Regiment arrived and was hastily briefed on the situation. A brief handshake was eloquent. We had a long journey ahead of us. The battalion dismounted and its vehicles disappeared into the darkness. None of the vehicles went through the city. They all turned south. Battalion after battalion arrived. In the meantime, day had come. The sky began to come alive again. There was no point in hiding from the planes that constantly loomed overhead. So the soldiers waved to me. They went forward for their baptism of fire calmly. They showed no self-pity. They were determined to prove themselves. Our paths were fiercely attacked by fighter bombers and shelled by the ship's guns. Nevertheless, we reached the coaling areas on time. I set up our forward command center in a monastery in Arden. My driver, Eric, had already exchanged our all-terrain Kefsved Tiefin passenger car for a lighter Volkswagen in order not to make him too conspicuous a target, but this precaution was of little use. As soon as we started moving, we found ourselves in a ditch. Machine gun bursts of fighters acting as attack planes loosened the ground around us. Again we got into the car, and in a couple of 100 meters we were lying in the ditch again. This was driving us crazy, but Eric soon figured out what to do. He started off with lightning speed, and as soon as the Allied fighter began to dive, my driver hit the brakes so hard that the car almost overturned. That's how Eric got me to the monastery. I was glad that I was now surrounded by thick walls. The monastery was an old ruin with a large garden surrounded by high walls of hard stone. 2 monastery towers dominated the area, providing a great view. One of the towers had already become an observation post for a battalion of heavy artillery. Bartling reported that the artillery was ready to fire. The soldiers of the motorized infantry units moved into their positions. Directly in front of me was the 2nd Battalion of the 25th SE Grenadier Motorized Regiment. I saw the combat reconnaissance unit disappear into the thicket. Heavy infantry weapons were set up in firing positions, and meanwhile machine guns and 20 anti-aircraft guns were firing at enemy bombers, fighters and attack aircraft. Everything was ready. But where were the tanks? Would they be able to reach the front? Wasn't it crazy to expect tanks in the face of complete air domination by Allied aircraft? However, instead of the tanks we were expecting, I heard a report from the Mortar Battalion commander. I was glad to hear that he had quite a lot of ammunition. The battalion had taken up positions on the northern outskirts of Cayenne. In the meantime, 10:00 p.m. had passed and the first tanks appeared. Relentless attacks by Allied attackers and bombers severely hampered their approach. The tank battalion commander reported that 50 TD tanks were ready for battle. The rest were on their way somewhere and would arrive during the night. Now I felt considerably better. Our attack without tank support was inevitably doomed to failure. If only we could suppress that damned fire from the ship's guns. Heavy shells howled over our heads like fast trains, plunging into the ruins of the city. Stormtroopers and bombers hardly bothered us anymore. We knew that this stuff would hang over us constantly in the future. I went up to the tower to look around the neighborhood. I thought I could see the shore. What a surprise! The terrain all the way to the shore lay before me like a sandbox on a staff drill. There was lively traffic on the shore, swaying on the waves one after another. More and more Allied ships. Countless barrage balloons protected this armada from air attacks. The latter was of no use. The Luftwaffe in northern France, it seems, no longer existed. West of the town of Dover-la-Delivrande lined up tank formations of the enemy. The whole area resembled an anthill, and what was behind us? Smoking ruins, empty roads, and burning vehicles. The Canfalais road was straight as an arrow for many kilometers, but there was not a hint of German combat units on it. They waited out daylight hours somewhere in hiding or camouflage and only dared to move forward at night. The stormtroopers attacked the monastery without doing us any harm. Soldiers scolded this locust of Allied fighters. Due to the absence of our aviation, conducted an assault on anything and everything on the ground. But what is it? Am I imagining it? An enemy tank was breaking through the Conti Gardens. Then it stopped. The tank commander opened the hatch and began to look around. Is he blind? Did he not realize that he was only 200 meters away from the 2nd Battalion of the 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, and the barrels of our anti-tank guns were aimed at him? Apparently not. He calmly lit a cigarette and stared at the smoke. Not a single shot had been fired by us. The battalion perfectly observed the discipline of fire. Then I realized what was happening. Everything became clear. The tank had been sent forward to provide cover from the flank. The enemy tanks were moving towards Oti from Bayonne. My God! What an opportunity! The tanks were moving right across the front of the 2nd Battalion of the 25th CS Grenadier Motorized Regiment. The enemy compound was exposing its unprotected flank in front of us. I gave the order to all battalions, artillery and tanks. Do not open fire. Fire only on my command. The commander of the 12th SS Tank Regiment positioned his command vehicle in the garden of the monastery. Communication was immediately established with the tank, and the enemy position was relayed from the turret of the commander's tank to all other tanks. One company of the tank regiment was on the grounds of the monastery and another on the opposite slope south of Frankville. The enemy troop commander seemed to be concerned only with the airfield. It was directly in front of him. In principle, the enemy tanks could already cover the airfield with their fire, but their commander did not realize that on the reverse slope of the heights awaited him defeat. As soon as the enemy tanks crossed the Rodcan Bayou, they will run into the 2nd Battalion of the 12th CS Tank Regiment. Only a few meters separated the iron monsters from each other. We watched this spectacle like mesmerized. The commander of the 12th SS Tank Regiment, Wenchier, calmly reported the maneuvers of the enemy tank. No one dared to speak loudly. I did like that. And the divisional plan of attack. But in this situation I had to take my own initiative. The 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment was still east of Orne, and the 1st Battalion of the 12th SS Tank Regiment could not move due to lack of fuel. It was 30 kilometers from Orne. Fuel could not be delivered because of the intense air raids. Medicine. As soon as the first enemy tanks pass Frankville, the 3rd Battalion of the 25th SS Grenadier Regiment will attack them with the support of our tanks on the reverse slope. As soon as the battalion reaches OT, other battalions will enter the battle. Tark, the commander of the 21st Armoured Division, was briefed on the situation. Unbearable burden fell on our shoulders at this point. The enemy's head units had already passed Frankville and began to cross the road. I signalled to 1She to begin the attack. The last thing I heard was, "Attention, tanks, forward." The tension was gone. They reported flashes of gunfire at Frankville. An enemy tank ahead caught fire, and I watched as the crew got out of it. New enemy tanks were blown to pieces with loud explosions. Suddenly, our TIV tank caught fire. Sheaves of flame burst out of the hatches. The Canadian infantry tried to reach OT and continue the fight from there, but all in vain. The soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 25th SS Grenadier Regiment, tried their best to keep the enemy tanks from gaining the upper hand. With the support of infantry, the enemy tanks intended to break into OTI. As soon as they succeeded, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 25th SS Motorized Regiment began their attack. With vigorous offensive actions, we took Frankville and OTI. They were to be followed by Conte and Baron. The enemy seemed completely discouraged. By this time, there was no artillery fire from either side. The attack proceeded rapidly. The prisoners were rounded up and sent to the rear with their arms raised. The 3rd Battalion of the 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment was advancing on Bayonne. The 2nd Battalion of this regiment had already passed through Conte and was fighting enemy tanks. I jumped on a motorcycle and went to the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Regiment. On the way I met the first wounded men. They were on their way to the infirmary. About 50 Canadians were standing with their hands up in the garden of Cussy, guarded by a few of our soldiers. I allowed them to lower their arms and ordered them to be immediately transferred to the monastery. The shadow of death hovered over the village of Cussy, but just beyond the last farmhouse it was livelier than I would have liked. Hardly had I reached the open ground when Canadian congratulations began to fly over my head. It was enemy tanks from the southern outskirts of Buren opening fire, but it was not easy to hit me. I was rushing across the field with the speed of lightning, and still I was covered. I don't remember how I found myself lying next to a Canadian soldier. Smoke and explosions surrounded me, and there was no end to it. We stayed close to the edge of the crater, not letting each other out of our sight. We were in the center of the place, which was already under artillery fire from the sea, and we ducked especially low when the heavy shells of the ship's guns howled over our heads. My motorcycle was lying in the field. It had turned into a pile of wreckage. I don't remember how long I lay in that damned crater. However, I noticed that the soldiers of our motorized units were just about to enter Buren. Tanks were burning on both sides of the village. I couldn't stay in this hole forever. I climbed out and rushed lightning fast to the 3rd Battalion, 25th CS Grenadier Motorized Regiment. The Canadian disappeared in the direction of Cussy. At that moment, Buren was covered by enemy artillery fire. A liaison on a roaring motorcycle approached. He recognized me, stopped, and we both chased. Between Bayonne and OTI met Milius. He proudly reported that his battalion had shown high morale. His casualties were insignificant at this point. Then a hurricane fire was opened on Buren. The village was no longer recognizable, only smoke. Explosions and fire marked its location. The enemy's artillery concentrated all its firepower on Buren, unleashing a monstrous avalanche of steel and fire upon it. Never before had I encountered such a concentration of artillery fire. I was reminded of what I had read about Verdun and what I had seen there with my own eyes. 24 years after the fighting of 1916, one company of the 3rd Battalion, 25th SS Grenadier Regiment, was in the very centre of this concentrated artillery fire. The remnants of the other companies were advancing toward Bissen. Milius followed his lead company. I went to the 2nd Battalion of the 25th SS Grenadier Regiment on another motorcycle. There was only light weapons fire on the Conte. A shaft of enemy artillery fire remained behind the battalion, and the battalion continued to attack in a northerly direction. Combat Scapini, who led his soldiers in the attack, was killed. A direct hit by a shell cut short the life of a true warrior. When I was already in the 1st Battalion of the 25th S Grenadier Panzer Regiment, I noticed with some concern that the 21st Panzer Division was not supporting our attack and that its tanks were standing idle. As a result, the right flank of the 25th Grenadier Regiment was open, and enemy tanks were already probing the flank of the regiment's 1st Battalion. This battalion found itself in the epicenter of a dangerous crisis of battle. After hesitating for a moment, the soldiers of the battalion remained lying down. Suddenly I noticed one, then several, running back to Melon. Giving orders would not save the situation. Something else had to be done. I ran after the young soldiers and pointed in the direction of the enemy. They stopped, looked at me, and then returned to their original positions. A T-5 tank drove into an anti-tank ditch and got stuck. The enemy tanks were closing in on us, coming within firing range of the anti-tank platoon. The first Sherman stood up, shrouded in smoke. The next one spun around and was shattered in seconds. That's when our tanks appeared and finished the job. Back to the regimental command post. 150 prisoners gathered in the courtyard of the monastery. They belonged to the 9th Canadian Brigade, which was part of the 3rd Infantry Division. The prisoners were either natives of northern Nova Scotia or from the crews of the 27th Tank Regiment. I talked to a few officers and then went back up the monastery tower. The forward observers were constantly calling fire on one target or another and adjusting the fire of the batteries. I saw no movement on the left flank. From the 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, only a reconnaissance company arrived in the combat zone. The battalions were so delayed by air raids that we could not count on bringing the 26th Grenadier Motorized Regiment into the fight. The 12th Reconnaissance Battalion still had not made contact with the enemy on the left flank of the division. It was reconnoitering in the direction of Bayeux. While the Chief of Artillery, SS Obersturmführer Metzel, was briefing me, we noticed a great deal of excitement west of the River Moy. Enemy tanks were advancing towards Bretteville. The Mew is a small river with thickets along its banks. Near the town of Roe, its banks become higher, especially the right one, which creates obstacles for tanks when attacking from west to east. This section was covered by a battery of 88 NEM anti-aircraft guns near Frankville. I looked restlessly at the dust clouds west of Mew. Enemy tanks were rolling one after another across the high ground toward Bretteville. There were no German troops in this sector that could stop the enemy's advance. The enemy's tank forces would thus, if they continued on the Bayeux Road, come directly into the area of approach of the 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment on the march. In Bretteville itself, there were only scattered detachments of infantry from the 716th Infantry Division. The way for deep enemy penetration to bypass our flanks was practically open. As we later found out, the units we observed were the 7th Canadian Brigade advancing in conjunction with the Ridgeline Rifles and Canadian Regiment's infantry units. Under the circumstances, the attack by the 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment should have been stopped immediately. It would have been irresponsible to continue the attack with its flanks denuded and against the monstrous fire of field and shipboard artillery. The attack was called off and the 1st Battalion, 25th SS Grenadier Regiment, was withdrawn as far as the positions of the 21st Armoured Division. Orders were received from the division to entrench in the positions taken and to go on the defensive until reinforcements arrived. In the monastery garden, the medical staff tended to the wounded. Our young soldiers lay side by side and cheered each other up. Canadians lay next to German soldiers. The doctors and paramedics did not look at what kind of uniform someone had. There was no distinction between them here. The only thing that mattered was saving lives. It had become impossible to evacuate the wounded. Allied fighters attacked every ambulance. The regimental doctors reported to me that the ambulance company attached to the regiment was no longer fully operational. The fighters attacked the ambulance company on the march and destroyed several vehicles carrying medical equipment. Unfortunately, several orderlies were killed. The Red Cross was no longer providing protection. To further highlight the ambulances, they were all painted white as snow, but this measure was also useless. With the help of French doctors, a temporary military hospital was set up. The French paid special attention to the seriously wounded Canadians. Under cover of night, the wounded and prisoners were nevertheless sent to the rear. The casualties of the first day's fighting were brutal. In addition to the commander of the 2nd Battalion, 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, several company commanders were killed or wounded. The 3rd Battalion of the 25th Regiment suffered heavy losses from fierce artillery fire at Baron. The Tank Battalion lost 6 TV tanks, 2 of which were destroyed completely. The enemy's losses were considerably greater. According to Colonel General Mel Gordon, the 27th Canadian Tank Regiment lost 28 Shermans, and the Northern Nova Scotia Highlanders lost a total of 245 men, killed, wounded, and an attack by the 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment halted the enemy advance on Cayenne. Unfortunately, it was impossible to continue our offensive on June 7. A well-thought-out joint attack by the 12th and 21st Panzer Divisions on June 7 would surely have been successful, and the bridgehead north of Cayenne would have been crushed if the conduct of this attack had been placed in the hands of skillful commanders of the formations. These divisions, however, were held in the rear and could be activated only after being authorized by the Wehrmacht High Command. The 2 divisions could operate together north of Cayenne as early as June 6. During the night, the 26th Grenadier Motorized Regiment arrived at its site. The threat to our flanks had finally passed. The 1st Battalion of the 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment was stopped when it attacked Nora and was unable to advance further. An attack by the 1st Company of this regiment on the right bank of the Mui River, which was to make contact with the 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, was smothered under flank fire from Nora. An attack by the 2nd Battalion, 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, resulted in the encirclement and destruction of 3 companies of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles at Pitho-en-Bessin. From the 9th Canadian Brigade, the Canadian Regiment from Nova Scotia received orders to counterattack, suffering heavy casualties. It pushed the 2nd Battalion, 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, into a position south of Pitho-en-Bessin. The 3rd Battalion, 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment held defensive positions along the railway embankment near Bronia. A tank training division under Lieutenant General Battalion arrived at the front at Thieges on June 8. The division had already suffered heavy losses on the convergence march. More than 40 armoured vehicles bringing fuel and 90 trucks were destroyed. 5 tanks, 4 tractors, and 4 self-propelled artillery pieces were also destroyed. These were serious losses for a compound that had not yet engaged in combat. Shortly after midnight, S. Obersturmführer von Ribbentrop came to me with a report to the command post. Von Ribbentrop had been wounded in the shoulder by a line from a low-flying airplane 2 weeks before the Allied landing. He stood before me with his arm in a sling. Von Ribbentrop had left the military hospital and was looking for his tank company. Since I knew this officer well from previous combat operations, I did nothing to send him back to the hospital. During the night, I visited battalions and checked individual company positions. I was stunned by the positive attitude and fighting spirit of my young soldiers. We old warriors were, frankly, highly impressed by what had happened during the day. The artillery fire and enemy air raids had their effect on us, but not on the young soldiers. For them it was the baptism of fire they had expected. They knew they had many more difficult days and weeks ahead of them. Their attitude deserved respect. While inspecting the battlefield at Auteuil and Frankville, important enemy documents were discovered. Communications instructions were recovered from the first enemy tank hit. By the evening of June 8, Canadian vehicles coming from Puteaux were crossing a mined bridge on the outskirts of Bronier right in front of the muzzles of our anti-tank guns deployed there. As a result, one of the cars was burned with passengers and crew. The other was unharmed, but the senior lieutenant and his driver were dead. An important map was found in this car. On it were accurately marked all enemy positions on both sides of the Orne River, with all the details, down to the individual positions of mortars and machine guns. Instead of the actual names of settlements and terrain features, The map used animal names that began with the same letter. For example, the Orne River was named Orinoco. The map marked terrain impassable to tanks. A notebook was found in the dead captain's possession with notes relating to the order to fight after the landing. The notebook also contained information regarding combat operations and rules regarding the use of civilians. The call sign codes among the captured documents had been used by the enemy for more than 2 days, which allowed our radio reconnaissance platoon to intercept and evaluate the incoming signals. On June 8 in the afternoon, I toured the 25th Regiment site with the division commander and then visited the 1st Battalion of the 26th Regiment. We had low-flying airplanes constantly hovering on our tail. I was glad to get my commander back to the command post in one piece. The 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment was then ordered to support the 1st Battalion, 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment by striking Bretteville-les-Guejos from the east. His attack was to be joined by the recently arrived tank company of the 1st Battalion, 12th SS Tank Regiment, and the 15th Reconnaissance Company, 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment. The attack was planned for the following night. Daytime attacks became impossible due to Allied air supremacy. Our TV Panther tanks advanced from Cayenne to Frankville to the front line shortly before nightfall. Because of this, they moved slowly to the staging area. Tank commanders were briefed briefly but thoroughly. Company and platoon commanders had studied the terrain before nightfall and knew every crease in it. The tank company took position for the wedge attack. Reconnaissance sat in their armoured vehicles. I went around the fighting vehicles one by one to say a few words of encouragement to the young soldiers. Company Commander von Büttner, my adjutant for many years, suddenly reminded me of a promise I had made to the 15th Reconnaissance Company of the 25th CS Grenadier Motorized Regiment during combat training in Belgium. Guys, the Reconnaissance Company always goes ahead of the regiment. You have a huge responsibility. I promise you that I will be with you to witness your baptism of fire. That time had come. The company was on its way to its baptism of fire. Consequently, I must accompany it. My old friend and comrade Helmut Belk arrived on a motorcycle with a sidecar. He had invariably been by my side as messenger, squad leader and platoon leader since 1939. He accompanied me to all the battlefields. In the baby carriage was Dr. Steve. I jumped into the back seat and told Helmut to drive to the Cayenne Bayou Road. The engines of the tanks roared to our right. The tankers climbed onto their fighting vehicles and hid in the tank turrets. The young soldiers were waiting for me. They clapped each other on the back and probably remembered my promise. They pointed to my motorcycle and turned their heads. My transportation seemed to be causing them some anxiety. The commander of the 12th Tank Regiment, Max Wunschy, wanted to accompany the Panther Company. He too had fought side by side with me since 1939. We knew each other. There was no need for explanation. A look, a sign, and the tanks rolled into the night. To the left of the road, a battery of 88 mm guns took up a firing position. In a few minutes, we left behind the last outposts. The tanks rolled forward at full speed near the right side of the road. There were no obstacles, and the mechanized tank drivers could use the capabilities of the 700 horsepower engine of the TV Panther tank to the limit. A squad of motorcyclists and a forward artillery observer vehicle followed a few hundred meters behind me. It was race time. The speed was increasing, only silhouettes were visible. I wanted to pass through the town of Roe before dark. That was the agreement with Wunschy. The first houses of Roe appeared. The tanks moved behind us to the right. It felt like sitting on a volcano, but Helmut continued to drive forward tirelessly. We only held tightly to the motorcycle so that, if the need arose, we could get off the road as soon as possible. On the outskirts of the village, we waited for the tanks. They arrived a few minutes later. The first squad of the Reconnaissance Company rushed and surveyed the area. There was no enemy in the township, and we quickly followed through Roe further. The Panthers also had to pass, one by one, through the township. As soon as it was left behind, they returned to the wedge formation. The Panthers rolled with a roar toward Bretteville, moving on either side of the road. In the darkness, I could only see the red-hot exhausts of the tanks. Norrie was already behind us on the left side. In the next few minutes, we should come across the Canadian outposts. Bretteville was only a few hundred meters in front of us. Bang, bang. The clang of gunfire echoed, and we could see fire erupting from the barrels of the tank guns. The two forward Panthers sent shell after shell from their guns. They cleared the road with fire and with a roar at full speed burst into the township. This is how we fought on the Eastern Front. But will this tactic of surprise attack achieve the same result in Normandy? Now all the tanks were firing on the town. In response, the enemy machine gun rang out. We took up a position right behind the 2nd Panther. I felt that the road was getting uncomfortable. We took the right and made our way forward along the ditch. I tripped over the body of a dead Canadian. A small armoured vehicle was smoking on the road embankment. As we went on, I heard someone moaning. A wounded man lay on the road to our left. Machine gun bursts were beating down the street. New Panthers with soldiers on them burst into the town. We moved forward along the ditch by running over. I reached the wounded man. He was lying on his side and moaning in pain. My God, it was von Buter. The scout company commander was wounded by a bullet in the stomach. I felt and found that the wound was severe. Buetna recognized me and shook my hand. As an old frontline soldier, he knew this was his last battle. Tell my wife that I loved her very much, his lips said slowly but distinctly. I knelt at the side while the doctor bandaged Buetna. Helmut Belk was covering us, kneeling a few meters away. I heard a sound from the other side of the road. A shadow ran across it. Friend or foe, Belk fired in the fall and hit the Canadian in the head. Belk himself also fell by the side of the road. My companion for so many years no longer stood up. He, like Buetna, had also fought his last battle and had been mortally wounded by a shot in the stomach. I tried to encourage him, but he wouldn't listen. No, 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 I know what it means. This is the end. Please let my parents know. Grenadier soldiers rushed past us. SE Oberscharführer SS Under, Major de Sau's son, shook Helmut's hand. Zander, too, was killed in action a few hours later. Tears rolled down my face. Old comrades were leaving one by one. I jumped into my motorcycle to catch up with our troops. Within seconds, I was engulfed in flames. The fuel tank was punctured and the motorcycle caught fire like a torch. The soldiers dragged me off the motorcycle and doused the fire with dirt. In the settlement, fire was coming from everywhere. We reached the centre, but our lead tank was hit. Nevertheless, the command centre of the Regina Rifles was captured by us. The surprise attack was successful, but where were the soldiers of the 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment? We could not hold the positions we had taken for long, and our forces were not enough to capture all of Bretteville. With a heavy heart, I decided at dawn to withdraw my units to the high ground east of Roe. The result of the fighting at this point was that the British general, later Field Marshal Montgomery, had not achieved his objective. According to the operational plan, Caen was to be taken by the Allies as early as June 6. Around noon, the 1st Battalion of the 26th Grenadier Motorized Regiment took up positions at Roe. SS Obersturmbannführer SS Wunschee was wounded during the night attack, and SS Obersturmführer Fuss, a platoon leader in a reconnaissance company, was missing. Von Buetna's successor was killed closer to evening. Thus, the 15th Reconnaissance Company of the 25th SS Motorized Regiment had lost 2 company commanders in the last 24 hours. I met the divisional intelligence officer at regimental headquarters. We both knew that the German High Command, in order for the bridgehead of the coalition forces to be destroyed, needed to act much more quickly. Until now, the panzer divisions were put into action as soon as they reached the combat zone. None of them could conduct a well-planned attack. Almost all tank units and formations were already forced to go on the defense. Urgently needed here infantry divisions were located east of the scene and remained unused. Day by day, we were getting weaker and the Allies were getting stronger. In the afternoon, the commander of the Tank Group West, General Georg von Schwettenberg, arrived at the command post. The general knew our division quite well. He often inspected it during training sessions. From him did not escape our shortcomings, and he saw our strengths. The general commended everything we had done. We went up to the observation post in the monastery. The general asked me for my opinion of the situation. I outlined in a few words the situation in my regiment's section and expressed my fear that the outcome of the war could be decided within the next few days. Von Schweppenberg cast a quick glance at me and said, "My dear Mr. Meyer, the war can now only be won by politicians." Von Schweppenberg told me that he had decided to launch an attack with several tank divisions. The 21st, the 12th Hitler Youth Division, and a tank training division. With these divisions, he wanted to break through to the coast. It was assumed that the training tank division will occupy the sector of Saint-Maurice. Puteaux-Brognier, the 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, which will be released in this case, should cut in on the section east of Mai. The attack was planned for the night of June 11. I believed that a night attack with such forces promises to be successful. In any case, the attack should have begun very early, so that by dawn we would already be in the enemy's positions, thereby negating the fire of heavy ship guns. Attack in the daytime seemed to me hopeless because of the superiority of the Allied coalition in artillery and aircraft. Preparations for the planned attack began immediately, but the difficulties were incredible. Ammunition and fuel could only be delivered at night. For example, ammunition had to be delivered from the forests north of Paris. The section in front of the 25th S Grenadier Motorized Regiment was quiet. The enemy was evidently too shaken by what had happened on June 7 and 8 and was not prepared to launch new attacks on Cayenne. In the area to our left, offensive and defensive fighting was going on intermittently, without ceasing. The tank training division had taken Melun and held that section. I'd already been informed at the beginning of the invasion that the Allies were not particularly adhering to the Geneva Convention and that the divisions already landed were taking few prisoners. On the morning of June 9, I found a group of German soldiers on the railroad south of Rho. It was obvious that they had not been killed in action as they were lying next to the road, and all had been killed by headshots. They were soldiers from the 21st Panzer Division and from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth. The case was immediately reported to the division, from the headquarters of which, in turn, it was reported to the corps. The commander of the 130th Tank Artillery Regiment from the Luxembourg Tanked Training Division was taken prisoner by the British, along with the battalion commander, Major Sietzler, Hauptmann Count Clary and Aldringen, and 6 other non-commissioned officers and privates on June 8. They were captured by units of the British Tank Regiment in Court, which had come to the rear of the German positions. After the German officers refused to volunteer to become human shields, the badly wounded Colonel Luxembourg was tied up by 2 British officers, beaten unconscious and bloodied, tied to a British tank as a human shield. After receiving orders from their superiors, the British tankers opened fire on Major Sietzler, Hauptmann Count Clary and Aldringen and other soldiers who were ordered to flee. Hauptmann Count Clary and Aldringen was discovered alive by SS Battalion Saarbrücken and taken to the command post. The British tank to which Colonel Luxembourg was strapped as a human shield was hit by a German anti-tank gun. The colonel died in a military hospital 2 days later. Hauptmann Count Clary and Aldringen was given first aid by SS Orderly Cloden. On June 7, we found a notebook in the Canadian captain's possession with notes on orders given before the invasion. In addition to instructions of a tactical nature, there were also instructions on how to fight. They read, "Take no prisoners." This notebook was handed over by the operations officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division to the commander of the 7th Army, Colonel General Dolman, on June 8. Officers and soldiers of the 3rd Canadian Division, who were interrogated by the 12th SS Panzer Division, confirmed that they had received orders from their superiors not to take prisoners. One soldier testified under interrogation that they were instructed not to take prisoners if they interfered with combat operations. During the trial of Berngard Saarbrücken, charged with war crimes in November 1948, Colonel Meyer Dettering of the General Staff, intelligence officer to the Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West, General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt. Immediately after the invasion began, I was twice handed documents captured at the Canadian Army station on the eastern flank of the invasion front, which showed that there was no intention to take prisoners. At the same trial, Lieutenant Colonel von Zastrow of the General Staff, who was intelligence officer to the commander of Panzer Group West, General Geer von Schweppenberg, testified that he received information at the time about crimes committed by Allied troops in violation of the Hague Declaration on the conduct of the war on land and the Geneva Convention. He then recounted one case in which a number of captured German soldiers had been shot by Canadian soldiers. Moreover, Lieutenant Colonel von Zastrow testified concerning a Canadian captain. This captain had been taken prisoner during the battle in the Somme River area, since he belonged to the same unit in which the installation records were found at the beginning of the invasion and where specific crimes had already been committed. Von Zastrow accused the Canadian captain of these violations of international law. When the Canadian was asked directly if he had heard of the shootings of German prisoners, the captain replied, "I did not take part in the invasion. I arrived in that unit with a resupply and served there for a short time. However, I heard about the atrocities. But then there were very strict orders that if such cases were repeated, the guilty would be punished. I cite these cases here because they illustrate the way the Allies fought, but also because they had a decisive influence on my own fate. I want to briefly address the issue of war crimes here before they are discussed further. Preparations for a systematic attack were in full swing. We had only a couple of hours to realize the only crushing blow on the bridgehead. If this strike is unsuccessful, another chance to throw the Allies into the sea will not. Once the attack is completed, all 3 armoured divisions will be exsanguinated and will no longer be able to repeat such an operation. After, in the presence of the commander of Army Group B, Field Marshal Rommel Tank, Group West were given combat orders. Training Tank Division reported on the breakthrough of the enemy from the west. Shortly after this report, the headquarters of Tank Group West was virtually destroyed by carpet bombing. Tank Group West lost its Chief of Staff, General Ritter, and Operations Officer Edler von Davens, as well as several other officers. During the attack, we also lost our liaison officer, Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Beck, who commanded a tank company. He had participated in all battles since 1939 and had been awarded the Knight's Cross for his participation in the battles to retake Kharkov. The communications battalion was put out of action. The general commanding it, who was lightly wounded, fled with a few men. As a result, control of Tank Group West was disrupted until June 26. As a result, a coordinated counterattack in the next few days failed. Under the pressure, which provided becoming day-by-day stronger British tank divisions, the German tank units were forced to go on the defensive. On June 11, the front came to life on the left flank of the 25th Cis Grenadier Motorized Regiment. I immediately went to the 1st Battalion, 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, and found Bernhard Kraus at his battalion observation post. Together, we watched the attack on the 12th SS Engineer Battalion's positions on the heights north of shore. The battalion's positions came under fire from guns of all calibers, and in a couple of minutes became a smoking, smouldering mass. We saw it all through a stereo telescope and, however hard we looked, could not discern any movement. The fire was then transferred to the back slope of the heights and gradually to the shore settlement. Canadian infantrymen jumped out of their trenches and out of thickets and, supported by tanks, attacked the sappers' positions. Bernhard Kraus reacted instantly. In a short time he had his heavy infantry guns on the selected targets, and the fire came in the thick of the attackers. This flanking fire had its effect. The enemy infantry was stuck on the forward slope of the heights and suffered heavy casualties. Some of the attacking tanks hit the battalion's minefields and were put out of action. Her Majesty's Canadian Regiment of Her Majesty's Royal Fusiliers and the 1st Hussar Tank Regiment were forced to retreat to their former positions. They did not attack again. On my way to the command post of the 25th Grenadier Motorized Regiment, I walked through Le Bourget's rakes to look at Bretteville and Norrie and to meet S.A. Upsturmfeuer Pfeffer. Pfeffer had long been Hitler's aide-de-camp and commanded a company of TV Panther tanks. His successor at Hitler's headquarters was then SS Hauptsturmführer Gunschi, who had previously commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 25th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment between St. Mauvier and Raux. I was fired upon from the Norrie side. Machine guns and anti-tank guns tried to hit me, but my good old BMW was a difficult target. I kept chasing fast in row, but what was that moving towards me? Isn't it a dream? It's the enemy tanks only 50 meters away from me. Indeed, it's them. 2 Shermans slowly crept out of town and stopped on the left side of the road. The barrels of their guns pointed straight at my motorcycle. There was no use turning back. I wouldn't be able to do it. So there was nothing else to do but keep going and slip between them. I picked up the speed. Maybe I could sneak out and hide in the woods on the right. Suddenly there was a bang on my right and behind me. I saw the first tank spin in place and one tanker jumped out of its hatch, as if he had been bitten by a tarantula. Obeying my instincts, I swerved to the right into a ditch and took cover in it. Before I realized what was happening, the second tank exploded. My companion and I immediately rushed back and took cover again. Only then did we realize what was really going on. We had skipped the last forward guard posts at the very moment when we were about to open fire on the 2 enemy tanks. Our troops didn't have time to warn us. Good old Pfeffer was in his TV Panther about 100 meters from the first enemy tank. He shot both Shermans, sending their crews to the other side. A day later, SS Hauptsturmführer Pfeffer died a hero's death, having received a fatal shrapnel wound. At the dressing station of the 25th Grenadier Motorized Regiment, I again found many wounded. The constant inflow of wounded in the absence of actual fighting had us all thinking. The fighting had so far proceeded mainly in such a way that our tank divisions were doomed to perish under the fire of ship guns, under the bombs and attack aircraft of the Allied Air Force, which prevented us from carrying out offensive operations. This was not to continue. Our armoured divisions had to gain freedom of manoeuvre. On June 11, the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Grenadier Motorized Regiment was attacked by Her Majesty's Canadian Regiment of Royal Canadian Rifles, reinforced by the 1st Hussar Tank Regiment and strongly supported by artillery. The attack was repulsed. Our battalion held the positions occupied. The enemy lost 12 tanks, while we in the course of these hostilities paid 3. Parts of the 8th Canadian Brigade, supported by the 46th Diversionary Airborne Detachment and tanks, attacked Rowe. Several enemy tanks were destroyed. The village was abandoned under the onslaught of superior enemy forces. A threatening situation developed near Tigy-sur-Seine on the right flank of the Training Tank Division, by order from the ISS Tank Corps. The last reserve of the 12th CS Tank Division, a divisional escort company, was urgently assigned to the Training Tank Division, which was thrown to the right flank of the Training Tank Division, where the situation was then stabilized. The situation on the front at Caen became more and more threatening day by day. The center of gravity of the fighting shifted to the positions of our neighbors on the left, the Tank Training Division. The enemy had managed to break through Balrois into Caumont-Levante. The enemy's 7th Panzer Division was making its way forward to Livry. The encirclement of the SSI Panzer Corps was beginning to take on increasingly threatening proportions. I was ordered to arrive at the division. There I met the commander of the ISS Panzer Corps, Colonel General Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich outlined the situation on the invasion front as a whole, frankly admitted to us that there were no reserves left, and that he no longer believed in the possibility of carrying out a systematic attack. He complained they want to defend everything. But with what? Those who defend everything don't defend anything. This axiom was first articulated by Frederick, "I the Great. Short-sighted people want to defend everything. Intelligent people concentrate on the main objective." As night fell, I went around the battalions of the regiment. Waldmuller settled down by the anti-tank ditch and gloated that all the British volleys came at the village behind his command post. There were no troops in it. The soldiers smiled at me, as I made my way through the positions. Forward posts were set up in hit enemy tanks. The guys were out of luck. They could only be changed by dawn. Reconnaissance teams were sent out from both sides all the time. In front of the 1st Battalion of the 25th th Grenadier Motorized Regiment was the left flank of the 3rd British Division, next to take positions 3rd Canadian Division. The vanguard of the enemy's 7th Panzer Division reached Hill 213 east of Villers Bocage by the morning of June 13. The commander of the 2nd Company of the 101st S Heavy Tank Battalion, SAO Sturmführer Michael Whitman, who had already destroyed 119 tanks in Russia and had been awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, moved ahead of his company to reconnoitre the terrain. Near height 213 he came across a column of enemy tanks. For the enemy it was a complete surprise. For a few moments Whitman hesitated to withdraw or to attack the superior enemy forces. His unit had suffered heavy losses from the bombardment of the last few days, and Whitman realized how valuable now every single tank, and that it is impossible to act rashly. But in this case, he had to attack. Otherwise, the vanguard of the 7th Panzer Division of the enemy came in the rear of the training tank division. Then there would be a breakthrough of the German front, and Kahn's defense upset. Whitman remained in place when the 22nd Tank Brigade of the enemy under the command of Hindi, without meeting resistance, entered the Villers Bocage. Because of this unexpected turn of events, the forward Allied tank unit carelessly moved on down the road in KN toward its objective, Hill 213. A company of motorized infantry following behind made a halt on the road. At that moment, the rumble of an 88mm tank gun broke the morning silence. The lead Sherman stood up, engulfed in flames, and a Tiger that had shot up the Sherman rolled out of the woods 100 meters away with a roar. He hit 3 more Shermans in a few seconds, then turned onto the road, drove along a line of half-tracked armoured cars, and set them all ablaze one by one. They were followed by about a dozen armoured vehicles of the regimental headquarters, artillery observers, and a reconnaissance platoon that got behind the row of vehicles. A 75 NEM shell fired from a Cromwell tank at point-blank range bounced off the Tiger without harming it. The Cromwell was immediately hit. In a few minutes on the road became like hell. 25 tanks and armoured vehicles were engulfed in flames, all of them victims of the only Tiger, whose commander was Whitman. Meanwhile, enemy tanks providing cover for Hill 213 were attacked and destroyed by the rest of Whitman's Tigers. Whitman's tank had its tracks knocked off and was immobilized. The crew dismounted and made their way back to the company. Wheeler Bocage was abandoned by the enemy, who withdrew to Livery. Whitman was awarded swords in addition to Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. By June 14, Whitman had destroyed a total of 138 enemy tanks and 132 guns. Units of the 49th British Division attacked positions on the left flank of the 12th SS Panzer Division. The attack was repulsed and the positions held. The division asked the corps for permission to withdraw from the ledge south of Puteaux and Bronier to the line from Segovia through Fontenay to TI. Radio reconnaissance established that the enemy intended to eliminate this ledge by attacking it. However, the corps headquarters refused to authorize a withdrawal. Allied forces on the bridgehead with every hour increased. By June 18, 500,000 soldiers with 77,000 different vehicles had landed in France. We were still waiting for reinforcements and the promised Luftwaffe support, but we waited in vain. Our tank divisions were being exsanguinated in battles in defensive positions. Cardinal decisions were not taken, everything was limited to tactical patching of holes. On June 16, I was asked to come urgently to the command post of the division. On the wire was Divisional Operations Officer Hubert Meyer, who said that the matter was urgent. I could not get any details from him and immediately rushed to headquarters. Tall trees felled by bomb and shell explosions were still blocking the road. The roofs of houses torn off on both sides of the road testified to the intensity of the enemy's shipboard artillery fire, which had ceased only about half an hour ago. I had a bad feeling. The headquarters greeted me with a discordant hum. The faces of the military men told me everything. The Chief of Staff stepped forward and reported. The division commander was killed half an hour ago. By order from the corps, you are appointed acting division commander. We stood there without a word, but in our handshakes there was a commitment and a promise. We would act with even greater tenacity for the sake of our comrade Fritz Witt and our common cause. I found the patch of grass on which Fritz Witt had been laid in his final resting place. I stood before what was our comrade. I could not look into his face. He no longer existed. Fritz Witt was killed because he was convinced that soldiers should be the first to take their place in the trench. When he decided to do so, an enemy shell hit the ground just in front of the trench and killed Witt on the spot. This loss shook us to the core. Fritz Witt was respected in the division by everyone, regardless of rank. He had close friendships with most of the officers both in peacetime and in war. The death of the commander perhaps even more strongly unites the division and further increases its will to fight the enemy. SE Obersturmbannführer Milius took command of my regiment. He had previously commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 25th SE Grenadier Motorized Regiment. I transferred his battalion to SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Steger. The division command post was moved to Versen. Late in the afternoon, the Chief of Staff reported to me in detail about the situation in the division. The losses of the division were considerable and, in some cases, irreplaceable. First of all, it is a large number of losses among officers and non-commissioned officers. Their incompleteness reached a dangerous limit. Most company and platoon commanders had already been killed or wounded in. Each motorized battalion had on average the fighting strength of 2 companies. There was no prospect of making up for these losses by the arrival of replenishments in the near future. In such a situation, it was even possible to calculate the day when the division will finally cease to exist. Continuous enemy artillery fire, along with constant raids by attacking aircraft and bombers, shook our 12th SS Panzer Division, against which, on its section of the front, fought the 3rd and 49th British, 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, as well as several tank brigades. There was no doubt among the officers of the division headquarters that in the next 1 or 2 days the enemy would try to pincer the front bulge on the left flank of the division to provide himself a convenient springboard for the subsequent offensive. At dawn I went around the positions of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 26th SES Grenadier Motorized Regiment and the 12th SS Reconnaissance Battalion. I determined their new positions. The mood of the soldiers was good. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, Berngard Seibkin, who had his finger blown off, accompanied me on his section. He did not want to leave the battalion and did not take the loss of his finger seriously. They were visible at Putos and burning enemy tanks. Bremer's Reconnaissance Battalion captured several enemy tanks and adapted them to reinforce their defensive positions. The battalion suffered significant losses and should have been withdrawn from its positions as soon as possible. The Corps gave the go-ahead for the division to withdraw to positions south of Meaux. The 12th SS Reconnaissance Battalion was withdrawn to divisional reserve. On the site of the training tank division, the British launched active offensives. The 50th British Infantry Division and several tank brigades fiercely attacked the positions north of Thiais-Chastel.